All right, so if we accept that stopping people at the border is unlikely to be effective, or is at least unlikely to be effective as a humanitarian gesture in preventing the exploitation of migrants, we then need to kind of reflect on what the positive alternative might be. So when it comes to thinking about alternatives to border protection, there's a couple of points that are really worthwhile emphasizing. All of these points arise out of a fundamental division which is at the heart of the reasons why migrant workers are precarious and vulnerable. This fundamental division is the division between the privileges that citizens of a particular country are afforded and the vulnerable status that non-citizens, outsiders, humanity in general, if you will, are excluded from. So it's this fundamental divide between citizenship and humanity, insiders and outsiders, which is crucial to understanding why and how migrant workers are exploited. But it's also crucial in terms of thinking about strategies, because a lot of the strategies we might want to contemplate when it comes to improving the rights and protections afforded to migrants and migrant workers ultimately boil down to ways of closing the gap between the privileges of citizenship and the vulnerability attaching to humanity in general, non-citizens. So when it comes to this side of the equation, there's a number of concrete steps that we can contemplate when it comes to closing the division between citizens and non-citizens. One of the most important of these, which I think Sam alluded to last week, stems from the fact that in a lot of cases, legal migrant workers lack the capacity to change their employers. This is because their employment status is what we described as tied. And as a consequence of being tied to a specific visa that enables them to legally reside, they're unable to effectively or easily express any grievances in situations where their employer ends up exploiting or excluding or otherwise harming them. So it's this inability to change employers. And crucially, the right to change employers is obviously something that citizens enjoy for the most part as a matter of course, but it's not something that migrants are included in terms of one of the rights that they have. So when it comes to strategies for redressing some of the abuses and vulnerabilities associated with migrant work, one of the most simple and straightforward steps is to enable migrant workers to seek other forms of employment. The capacity to seek employment in turn creates a bargaining chip or a platform for negotiation with the current employer, because it creates a situation where the prospect or possibility of employment elsewhere provides the migrant worker with a foundation to suggest that they may not want to be employed by their employer anymore. So, changing employers, fundamental to enabling greater scope for migrant workers to exercise their interests and to be properly paid and supported for their labors. Secondly, and I think directly relatedly, it's important to emphasize that in a lot of cases, migrant workers, either legal or illegal, don't get paid for the hours they work. So in a lot of cases, people are asked to kind of stay back and help around the house, or to work kind of overtime in order to ensure that a construction deadline is hit, or so on. And in these situations, it's frequently the case that hours labored are not reflected in pay received. So in terms of kind of providing support for migrant workers, one of the simplest and most direct remedies we have available is to provide ways of seeking back pay or additional pay in situations where people have worked longer than they're expected to or longer than they otherwise should, but there's no recognition or compensation following from their additional exertions. So change employers, back pay, and finally, and in a similar vein, we need to recognize that in a lot of cases, migrant workers are unable or unwilling, often for good reason, to draw attention to abuses or limitations in their working conditions. And it's in this context that avenues to express grievances become crucial to challenging or changing the ways in which workers are treated. Now, avenues for express grievances may sometimes exist on paper, but they're not particularly useful in situations where there's no protection against retribution from angry or aggrieved employers. So having a formal avenue to express grievances, and grievances can sometimes be serious, particularly in relation to physical and sexual abuse, there's very little that can be done in situations where raising issues becomes the basis for retribution of various kinds from employers. So in all of these cases, you begin to see concrete and practical steps which begin to close the gap between the privileges that citizens enjoy and the rights and protections that migrant workers are able to exercise. So in a lot of cases, there's a fundamental division here. The types of workplace arrangements, pay and conditions, employment contracts, all governing migrant workers are substantially and deliberately different to the same types of terms and conditions that workers from the countries in question enjoy. So in all of these cases, there's a need to close the gap. The protections, prerogatives, privileges that citizens enjoy must also be extended and afforded to migrant workers in various ways. And one of the biggest protections that might be afforded to migrant workers is the capacity to eventually become a citizen of the countries within which they work. So it's a pathway to citizenship, which is frequently and automatically denied to workers who labor legally in countries, frequently for years, sometimes for decades. Yet when their labors are over, migrant workers are expected, as a matter of law, to return to their home countries. There's no pathway for them to become naturalized. There's no legal right to become citizens of the countries within which they have worked for extended periods and whose societies and economies they have contributed to. So migrant work is by design precarious. This precarious nature stems from the division between citizens and non-citizens. And in a lot of cases, what should ultimately happen when it comes to protecting migrants is that migrants move from the status of non-citizen to eventually becoming citizens, and then hopefully, in many cases, having their families also enjoy the same privileges. Because in a lot of cases, migration and labor is solitary, and people are expected to move without their families, and there's no expectation that their families can ever legally join them. So citizenship ultimately not only requires migrant workers to become citizens, it also eventually needs to have the same status afforded to their immediate family members, children, wives, husbands, and so on. So this is fundamental to protecting migrant workers, but it's crucial to recognize that they're not necessarily popular or easy choices to make because, as Sam and I have mentioned previously, these types of additional protections kind of go up against the enduring patterns of kind of racism and xenophobia, which are foundational to the social hostility which migrants generate amongst the communities within which they reside. So it's important to recognize here that the types of remedies that I have proposed are actually relatively straightforward in terms of legal provisions and regulation, but they're obviously far more complicated from a political and economic standpoint because they ultimately require the privileges associated with citizenship to be closed and additional protections afforded to migrants, which in many cases makes migrants less desirable, because precarious and exploited migrant labor is foundational to the way in which the global economic system is structured. And protecting migrants, giving them greater opportunities, giving them greater ways of expressing their interests and organizing in protection of their rights, is ultimately something which is going to present a direct challenge to all the benefits that the current economic system generates for those further up the chain and for those who are on the inside of this division between human and citizen.